Welcome to the world's second largest democracy.
Second largest, deepest, widest.
India, of course, gets the prize. And so you mentioned that there was a vote to take place in Kashmir in the fall of 2008. What happened?
Well, soon after this uprising, actually, the Indian government did a remarkable thing. It called for elections. And everybody was shocked because they thought the elections were going to just backfire very badly. But what they did was they did a massive round of arrests. They arrested, hundreds of people. They announced curfew, they locked down districts. And then the political parties, which are the mainstream parties, sort of pro-India parties, went around promising people that the elections had nothing to do with the Azadi issue. They were just about roads and drains and municipal issues. And of course, you've got to ask, what is the meaning of an election in the presence of 500,000 or 700,000 soldiers, year in, year out, day in, day out? Would you accept that if it was happening in another country? But because India is a great market now, it's allowed to massacre people, it's allowed to have a military occupation, it's allowed to do a lot of things by the international community because it's a great investment destination. So there was a huge turnout in the elections, and a government came to power, and now the militancy is creeping back. Every day, you hear about violence, and of course the government it's equipped to deal with violence in Kashmir because it has a soldier for every 20 civilians. It's not equipped to deal with the mass uprising. But then the mass uprising cannot last forever, So.
Our dear friend and teacher, Howard Zinn, passed away in late January. And he had this comment about elections. He said, voting is easy and marginally useful, but it's a poor substitute for democracy, which requires direct action.
Well, I think it's the connection between elections and democracy is becoming more and more distant, In India, which is, even though, it's becoming, supposedly becoming an economic power, on the Human Development Index is still at the bottom of the pile. Still, the majority of people are malnutritioned. It has the largest population of malnutrition children in the world. 180,000 farmers committed suicide because they're caught in debt. But this country spent much more money on its elections than the US did. Can you imagine that? And you have to ask, where does this money come from? And in fact, what has happened is that the elections are now corporate sponsored. And the corporate sponsored both parties. The 90% of the independent candidates lost. And most of the members of parliament are millionaires. And many of them win with just a 10% margin, So, in fact, I was traveling in South India recently, and with a Dalit, a Dalit MP, a Dalit is untouchable caste, whatever, MP is a friend of mine. He said to me, I'm very scared to go to my constituency now, because the people have become servants. He says, all they want is money. He said, you ask, if there's a flood, they want money. If there's no flood, they want money. So I said, what do you mean by this? They're paid political parties pay them for votes. The media in many areas actually makes political parties pay them. For every constituency, they have to pay certain newspapers a fee, not to write bad things about them. And there's a separate fee to write good things about them in the news. There are media packages, small, medium, and large, for elections. The corporates are the biggest, the most highly excited people about elections. And in the last general elections, in these cafes in Delhi, there were these big $500 bills, I think, with Ben Franklin on one side morphing into Gandhi on the other side. And it said, "Kya India ka vote badlega dunya ka note?" Meaning, will the Indian vote rescue the world's markets? Because India was seen as this new market, this new consumer sort of destination where people could buy the world out of a crisis. So the connection between elections and democracy is becoming very, very tenuous, indeed.
Well, I'm glad that at least we live in this country that is, free from any kind of corporate influence.
Small media.
And of course, none of our representatives are incredibly poor and, just live
But do you have
penurious
small, medium,
existences.
and large packages?
We have a free press.
Tell me, alternative radio.
We have a free press.
You have a free press.
Now, of course, as you know, India is Thomas Friedman's most favorite country, Charlie Rose of PS.
Last time
PBS.
I came here, I offered myself up. I said I was looking for a job, that I wanted to be his tour guide in India next time. I'm still ready to do that.
Well, it's their favorite country, and of course, India is a great counterpoint to nasty China and dangerous Pakistan, and it's this emerging global, economic power, world's largest democracy. India has been very successful in selling this brand, particularly in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. How has it been able to do that?
Well, I think because it's being marketed as this great finance destination, So it's not just India that's being successful in marketing itself, but for example, a number of foreign correspondents in Delhi have told me that they have explicit orders from their desk, from their editorial, no bad news from India. Because if it's a democracy, it's lovely to be investing there, right? But if you go around talking about the fact that they are massacring Muslims and they've announced a war on their own indigenous people, then it doesn't become such an attractive destination. But I just want to say that, like I said in the beginning, these words like India are getting more and more difficult for me to use because there's the government of India and the Indian elite that's sort of fused with the government. But it is remarkable what is going on in India now. And there are things that are happening there which make me proud. The kind of resistance, the bandwidth of serious resistance that's going on. It's really something, that one must salute.
It's interesting that you should say that because when I was there just a couple of months ago and traveling to some of these areas, and I wrote back to Howard Zinn about all of these, multiplicity of movements, some of them not very evolved and developed, and some of them very vibrant. And he wrote back, he said, compared to the United States seems to be a desert compared to what's going on in India. Now, you've written about this juggernaut of injustices, which has turned the country into a tinderbox of massive unrest. Kashmir, of course, being just one of many. Now, on your way out of Srinagar, you had an interesting conversation with, I believe, an Indian military officer. Could you relate that?
Well, I guess to explain that to this audience, I'd have to say that recently the Indian government has announced a war called Operation Greenhunt, which is a war that is taking place in the forested heart of India, in what is known as the Red Corridor, which spreads from West Bengal through Chhattisgarh, through Jharkhand, Orissa, and bits of Maharashtra. If you look at a map of India, the forest, the minerals, the indigenous people, and what is now an increasingly influential Maoist movement are all stacked up on top of each other. And the Prime Minister declared the Maoists the greatest internal security threat in 2005. at a time when, in fact, they had been decimated. I think they'd lost something like 1,600 of their cadre. They had been decimated, but he said they were a threat because in 2005, the government signed a whole lot of memorandums of understanding worth billions of dollars for the bauxite and the iron ore and all the other minerals in that forest belt. So this Operation Greenhunt, which was announced a few months ago, a lot of activists also in India started saying, but now the country is making war on its own people. And this army officer in the airport in Kashmir said, we cannot be deployed in the heartland of India because we cannot fight our own people. So I said, is that an acknowledgement that Kashmiris are not your own people? And the people in the Northeast are not your own people. But the fact is that ever since India became independent in 1947, it turned into a colonial power almost immediately. It started annexing land and making war. And if you look at the list of military interventions on its own so-called territory, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Assam, Kashmir, Punjab, Telangana, Goa, Hyderabad, it's always preferred to solve political problems with the military intervention.
Now, the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh,
who's that? Okay.
He sort of let the cat out of the bag.
He, incidentally, the Prime Minister of the world's greatest democracy, has never won an election in his life.
He inadvertently perhaps let the cat out of the bag in June of 2009 in a message to Parliament. He said, if left-wing extremism continues to flourish in parts of India which have natural resources, the climate for investment would certainly be affected.
See, the thing is that, while we talk about Kashmir and the army being turned into a police force, the opposite is happening in the rest of India. The police is being turned into a kind of army, because to push through these economic reforms, to build these huge infrastructural projects, the most important thing is to push people off their land. So you have our own Dick Cheney is the Home Minister called P. Chidambaram, he's from Harvard, and he's a corporate lawyer who worked with, he was a non-executive director of the board of directors of this big mining corporation called Vedanta. Mm-hmm. And he was the lawyer for Enron. And then he became the finance minister. And he said that his vision for India was that 85% of India should live in cities, which means 500 million people should be moved off their lands. To do that, you need to become a police state. That's what's happening now. I mean, just big dams have displaced 30 million people. India has the largest sort of population of internally displaced people, these refugees to progress, But right now what is happening is that I wonder, I don't know this for a fact, but as I said, in 2005, these MOUs, these memorandums of understanding were signed with the major mining corporations of the world. But they have not been actualized because the resistance has not allowed it to happen, which is a huge thing, And I don't know anywhere else where this, at this level, a resistance has managed to do that. They are now 70,000 paramilitary troops are moving into the forests, and the war is on. But inside the forests are the Maoists, who are an armed resistance group. But outside there are all kinds of other resistances. There's what I keep calling a biodiversity of resistance. That is what you need, and that's what's going on.
This Operation Greenhunt is, of course, with the backdrop of what is called by a government report, I believe, the greatest land grab since Columbus. And you've described it as a 21st century gold rush enabled by Luti Sarkar. What is Luti Sarkar?
Luti Sarkar. Well, I just spent, just before I came here, I had an appointment with the greatest internal security threat. And I got a note slipped under my door inviting me to go into the forest and walk with the Comrades.
This is in Chhattisgarh.
In Chhattisgarh. So the note said, I had to be at the Ma Danteshwari Mandir in Dantewada, Chhattisgarh on any of 2 given days at 4 different times so that, I could make the appointment even if something happened, punctures or whatever. And it said, writer will have a tika, like a red bindi, a coconut, and a camera. And a camera. And the meter would have a Hindi Outlook magazine and a banana and a cap. So I arrived at this temple and I was like standing around feeling ridiculous with this bindi and this whatever it was. And this little boy with red nail polish came to me and he said, "Are you the one who wants to go in?" I'm like, "Where is your Outlook?" Then he took out a note and said, "Outlook nahi mila," means I couldn't find Outlook. And I said, "And where is the banana?" He said, "I ate it. I was hungry." I'm like, "All right." Anyway, I went in and I spent 2.5 weeks walking in the forest with this sort of indigenous guerrilla army, 45% of which armed cadre are women. And it was just an unbelievable experience, But basically, they are now under threat, surrounded by this army closing in. The marketplaces are full of informers. Many villages have been burnt. Hundreds of people are living off the forest, refusing to leave, but unable to go home. So it's a very, very frightening situation, but there's an incredibly brave resistance going on there, which, I really fear could go very wrong because, the more weapons that are pushed into those areas, the people's weapons come from the police. They snatch it from the police. Like the Taliban's weapons are from the American army, The more weapons you flood into a place, the weapons are going to end up on the other side. But that doesn't mean it's a great thing, eventually to have a weaponized population fighting a war like this is terrible. But at the same time, it's better than having that jungle wiped out and turned into a mine, which is what the option is. So,
what are their chances for any reasonable amount of success?
It's
and what would constitute success? Going back to their lands, preventing the mines from being developed?
Well, what would constitute success is a very interesting question because what was going on in that forest was not what even I thought I would encounter. Because it's not that this resistance started off as a resistance against mining. It's been there for 30 years. They've been working there with the people politically for 30 years. So just the women's organization has 90,000 members. All 90,000 technically qualify as being Maoist. Are they going to be wiped out? You asked about what do you mean by Luti Sarkar? They have sort of people's governments. They have water harvesting schemes. So I was talking to one of the farmers, and he showed me the series of ponds, large, huge ponds as big as this auditorium, dug rainwater harvesting ponds where they'd stored rainwater and they were growing food. And then he would show me some ponds were completely dry. So I said, what are these? He said, "Ye to luti sarkar ka hai," which means these are the people's government. We dug them, and this is the government that loots. The Indian government that just digs a pond anywhere, and it doesn't hold water even when it rains. He says, because they never asked us where they should dig it, what it should be. So there's a whole. It's not as if this is some alternative society that's been set up to save the world, but it is an alternative to its own annihilation, and that I think is something that should be saluted, that they could do with help. They could do with doctors and teachers and schools and agricultural experts, but not with war, and it could be, and if Indian society begins to be able to accommodate that, to be able to say, okay, we will leave the bauxite in the mountain, we will leave the iron ore in the floor, we will leave the water in the rivers, we leave the wood in the forests, then you have to begin to think of an alternative to this kind of marauding capitalism where you think you can just go through everything like a locust, So it's not as though the alternative imagination is going to come from the people who dreamed this up in the first place, It's going to come from somewhere else slowly. And if we can say, okay, this forest and these people and this knowledge of how to live with a very light footprint in the world is something we have to preserve. From there, you can slowly climb into another place where you're rethinking life. But if you're going to destroy that, then you're going to destroy yourself too, in the end.
The people fighting back are among the most indigent and disadvantaged in the world. You've spent 3 weeks with them most recently. And I want to, if I can, connect it with what's going on or not going on in the world's second largest democracy, where there's a kind of weekend activism. We go to the march on Saturday or Sunday, and then Monday we go back to work. And there's a lot of motions, but there are no movements here.
Resistance without consequences.
You talked about this, that resistance must involve risks and consequences. What about what's going on in the U.S.? Because it seems to me that there's not a lot going on.
Well, I mean, I'm not, I'm not someone who spent a lot of time here, so it's hard for me to, kind of come out with some prescription of what people should do here, and it's not my kind of thing anyway to give people advice. But I think really often it's a question of imagination, and I find that people who, oddly enough, people who are fighting for their survival, people who have their backs against the wall, people who are being killed and buried in mass graves, they have more hope than people who are comfortable. People who are comfortable are very easily reach the conclusion that there is no hope. But when I was walking in the forest, it was full of hope. It was full of ferocity. And it was very, very interesting because I said, this army is, we would be walking maybe 200 armed people under the nose of all these police stations, camping at night. In the morning when we left, or at night when we left, there would be no sign that we had been there. So it was an army that was more Gandhian than any Gandhian, that left a lighter carbon footprint than any climate change evangelist. Even their sabotage techniques are Gandhian. They'll rip a police car apart, they'll take the Rexine for ammunition pouches. They'll straighten the steering wheel to make rifle barrels. They'll use the battery to power the computer, one computer they had, and then they'll blow it up. You know? So I said I wanted to write a play called Gandhi, Get Your Gun. You know? Sort of. So,
Maybe a musical.
yeah, a musical. But it was, the other very interesting thing about it was that, you know, I mean, of course, India is a land of Gandhi and great Gandhian struggles, and of course, they have their place. But in the forest, in that forest, in the middle of the night, when it's so dark, and 1,000 policemen come and surround a village and burn it and rape women, what are you going to do? I mean, when people are starving, can they go on a hunger strike? When people don't have money, can they refuse to pay their taxes? Can they boycott goods when they don't have any goods? You know, in a way, it occurred to me that Gandhian protest always needs an audience, in which case you need to belong to that society. But these are people who are outside it. Nobody cares, you know, what they do, what they don't do. So there's a very, very, it was on the last day when we were leaving, I was, you know, they were, because there's this river called Indravati, and across the river is what the police call Pakistan. So the superintendent of police who had met on a previous trip told me, across that border, ma'am, we shoot to kill. My boys shoot to kill. So when I was inside the forest and coming out, just as we were approaching, like we had to climb this hill to get onto the road where someone was going to come and pick me up. And for the first time when I was being taken up, suddenly I heard all of them taking almost simultaneously sort of unclicking the safety catches on their guns because we were approaching the border. And then this man, I mean, this forest is full of people with no names. That was the lovely thing. All of them they change their names at will. They have many names and no identities, no keys, no homes, no addresses, no phones, nothing. It's wonderful, actually. And they asked me, when they unclicked the safety catch, he turned to me and said, you know what to do if we come under fire, right? I said, yeah. He said, what? I said, just declare an indefinite hunger strike. He sat down on a rock and laughed for a long time, you know, before they let me go. But the thing is that it really does make you rethink the meaning of how do you resist, you know, in effective ways. So to answer your question about what people should do here, the thing is you got to do damage, you know. You have to become an internal security threat. Otherwise, you have to live with what you got. Shall I catch the next plane out?
Some questions. Are you planning on ever writing fiction again?
Who is it who said life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans? Yes, I am planning, but you know, it's very difficult to live in India in these times and be able to set time aside for the project of fiction, which I know is very important, you know, but it's just that there's such I'm on such a roller coaster in terms of, it's not that I have the luxury of walking in the forest and then coming back and saying, let me think about writing it sometime. You have to do it now because people are dying now, you know. So I mean, it's a terrible dilemma, but I don't know what to do about it. But I am desperate to write fiction again. And I mean, I think the idea of writing more footnotes drives me crazy, you know, but sometimes you have to do it.
Another question from the audience. If India sets Kashmir free, do you think it sets a precedent for other regions in the country that have asked or could ask for independence?
Well, I mean, if India, I don't know, again, this word India, but let's look, to me, it's not important, you know, that shape on the map. I think if people feel fulfilled and happy and within that place, they will stay, but it cannot be used as an excuse. You can't militarily occupy one place and say, I'm doing this so that that place doesn't erupt, you know. And actually, I think that the real problem is that increasingly, as there's a run on resources, all kinds of battles in different disguises are going to erupt. Sometimes they take the shape of religious wars or caste wars or identity wars. But at the back of it, I mean, I think one thing we all should think about is that in that part of the world, from Afghanistan through Waziristan, through the northeast of India, through this entire belt which is being called the tribal corridor or the Maoist corridor, it's all tribal uprisings. You know, whether it's an uprising with the face of militant Islam or the extreme left, basically the attack on them is an attack of the free market. It's the attack to control their resources and to control them geopolitically, you know. So it is very interesting to look at it in that way.
Another question. How can we engage Hindus in the diaspora to understand the realities of the BJP, the VHP, RSS, all those right-wing Hindu fundamentalist organizations? And it seems that most of the Hindus, this is a comment, it seems that most of the Hindus who immigrate from India support those views.
I mean, I don't think there's any lack of information. I think people have chosen which side they want to be on, and there is a battle that's unfolding. So it's not a question of people not being aware.
What is your view on President Obama's escalation of the war in Afghanistan, and how is that affecting India? Is India taking advantage of US military intervention?
Again, this India-US, I mean, you know, I was thinking about it, and I think that on the one hand, you could look at it in this way, which is that it's easy to start a war, it's easy to bomb people from the sky, but then in order to nail it down, you need to have boots on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq, in Kashmir. You can't, that war never ends because you need to control populations. And so you can't win that war in a way. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking that the US state, not the US people, but the US state has got what it wants, which is a strategic position in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. It's opening bases, it's controlling China. Even, I mean, I can even imagine that the recent irritation that is being shown towards Israel is because it already has its own base now in Iraq, you know, and doesn't need an agent. So it's very, very interesting what's going on, you know. Of course, it's US citizens' money that's being poured into trying to make a police force or an army that doesn't work in Afghanistan. But at the same time, the sort of corporate power does have its strategic positions, and it does have its air bases all over. And in a place like India, it doesn't need to occupy India because it has a comprador elite that is, you know, offering its hearts and minds without being asked.
Something that Frantz Fanon wrote about in Wretched of the Earth, always having local relays, you know, educated at Harvard and Princeton, and do I dare say Cal? I did. I neglected to mention, by the way, that the The books are published by Haymarket Press, a remarkable, fairly new press, independent, that's doing terrific work, and another reason to get those particular books. To go on to another question, what has been the response to your recent Walking with the Comrades article in Dawn, as well as, that's the leading Pakistani English newspaper, as well as in India? Have you gotten any feedback?
Actually, I wrote it and fled. So I don't know. I finished it at 2 in the morning and got the next flight out. I mean, not deliberately, but I haven't been following the response, but I think it's huge. But basically, let me be more serious about this. Basically, the thing is that this population of people that lives in the forest on these mineral resources are unwanted people. They are what the Germans used to call Überzahligen Essern, which means superfluous eaters. And the elite and the middle class that have seceded into outer space look down at those forests and say, what's our bauxite doing in their mountains? What's our iron ore doing in their forests? What's our water doing in their rivers? And this unwanted population has to be got rid of. And I'm not saying this lightly. It has to be got rid of. And historically, ways of getting rid of unwanted populations have not necessarily just been by putting them into concentration camps or gassing them. It's also been by laying siege to them, cutting them off from their resources. This is a population that's on the brink of survival, and now with this military intervention of not allowing them to go to the market, not allowing them to go home to their villages, the government of Chhattisgarh actually declared that it actually started a people's militia that went burning villages, as it went. Something like 644 villages were emptied. And people were being forced to move into these roadside camps, strategic hamleting like the US did in Vietnam. And the chief minister said that those who don't come to live in these camps are with the Maoists, which meant that just looking after your chickens or staying at home was dangerous terrorist activity, and you could be killed for that. So what has happened is that this population is being prepared for a kind of gentle genocide. And in order to prepare a population for that, you have to sort of sever the link between normal human society and them. So they are either Maoists or they are people who live in museum cultures, as P. Chidambaram said, but they are basically faceless, nameless, dehumanized. So when they slip away, you won't notice. So for me, what was important about going in there, and it was as a writer to make them human, to give them faces, and to tell you what kind of people they were, and what kind of humor they had, and what they did, and how they, I mean, for me, it was very much part of my fight, what they are fighting. It's not that I was some foreign correspondent going there to look at the insurgents uprising, I mean, people keep referring to them as insurgents. It's their land, it's their place. They've lived there for centuries. How can you call them insurgents?
Well, I think Arundhati Roy would like to close with a reading.
I just want to read 2 minutes to you before we end. So this is just the end of the introduction to this book. Perhaps the story of the Siachen Glacier, the highest battlefield in the world, is the most appropriate metaphor for the insanity of our times. Thousands of Indian and Pakistani soldiers have been deployed there, enduring chill winds and temperatures that dip to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Of the hundreds who have died there, many have died just from the cold, from frostbite and sunburn. The glacier has become a garbage dump now, littered with the detritus of war. Thousands of empty artillery shells, empty fuel drums, ice axes, old boots, tents, and every other kind of waste that thousands of warring human beings generate. The garbage remains intact, perfectly preserved at those icy temperatures, a pristine monument to human folly. While the Indian and Pakistani governments spend billions of dollars on weapons and the logistics of high-altitude warfare, the battlefield has begun to melt. Right now, it's shrunk to about half its size. The melting has less to do with the military standoff than with people far away on the other side of the world living the good life. They're good people who believe in peace, free speech, and in human rights. Does that sound like you? They live in thriving democracies whose governments sit on the UN Security Council and whose economies depend heavily on the export of war and the sale of weapons to countries like India and Pakistan, and Rwanda, Sudan, Somalia, the Republic of Congo, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's a long list. The glacier melt will cause severe floods in the subcontinent and eventually severe drought that will affect the lives of millions of people. That will give us even more reason to fight. We'll need more weapons. Who knows, that sort of consumer confidence may be just what the world needs to get over the current recession. Then everyone in the thriving democracies will have an even better life, and the glaciers will melt even faster. This last part that I'm going to read refers to a lecture that I did in Turkey called Listening to Grasshoppers, which was about the Armenian genocide, and it was the memorial of the assassination of the Armenian journalist Hrant Dink, whose wife was sitting in the audience. So while I read Listening to Grasshoppers to a tense audience packed into a university auditorium in Istanbul, tense because words like unity, progress, genocide, and Armenian tend to anger the Turkish authorities when they are uttered close together. I could see Raquel Dink, Hrant Dink's widow, sitting in the front row, crying the whole way through. When I finished, she hugged me and she said, "We keep hoping. Why do we keep hoping?" "We," she said, "not you." The words of Faiz Ahmed Faiz, sung so hauntingly by Abida Parveen, came to me. Nahi nigah mein manzil to justuju hi sahi, nahi visal mayassar to arzu hi sahi. I tried to translate them for her, sort of. If dreams are thwarted, then yearning must take their place. If reunion is impossible, then longing must take its place. You see what I meant about poetry. Thank you. On behalf of the comrades who I walked with in the forest, Lal Salam, which means red salute.